I've got one last source of prejudice to think through, and then we're going to call it a day for today. And that's prejudice on the part of other employees. So the idea here is that maybe your employer doesn't care at all about the race of their employees. Customers don't care at all about the race of their employees, but some fraction of the potential employees that would be hired by a firm don't like working with other types of employees, right? So to keep with our white, non-white idea, we might think that white workers are prejudiced against non-white workers and therefore have some distaste for working at firms that employ non-white workers. So to keep this simple, we're going to imagine that all white workers in this model have the same level of discrimination or distaste toward non-white workers, and that they don't care about the number of white or non-white workers at a firm. They just care about whether their firm hires any non-white workers. You're going to look at a slightly more general version of this in your problem set and see that most of these assumptions aren't necessary. Right, so essentially what we're saying is that for white workers, suffer, I'll put this in quotes, right, I'm not trying to sympathize with it, suffer a cost D from employment with non-white workers. And let's imagine for now that non-white workers don't care. Right, again, there's various versions of this model that we could explore. So in this case, we're going to imagine that white workers at an integrated firm, let's say white workers at a white-only firm, earn a wage, let's say WW. White workers at an integrated firm are going to perceive their wage as WW minus D. Right? In other words, they're going to suffer some cost from interacting with fellow employees who are non-white. So just like we did before, we're going to say that they're going to work at white-only firms. Oh, sorry, I'm going to add one more piece of, one more obnoxious W. So WWW is the wage of a white worker at a white firm. WIW is the wage of a white worker at a racially integrated firm. Make sense? So they're going to work at white firms only as long as WW is greater than WWW greater than WIW minus D, right? In other words, if D is less than the difference in wage that they get working at an all-white firm relative to an integrated firm. Oh, I messed this up, sorry. They're going to work in an all-white firm if D is greater than WWI minus WWW. Sorry. Thanks for rolling with me there. Okay, great. Right, so basically what we're saying is they need to get paid a wage premium to work in an integrated firm. So then the question is, are they going to get a wage premium from working at an integrated firm? The answer to this is going to be no. Why not? Because we've said from the beginning that white and non-white workers are identical other than prejudice. So if employers are not prejudiced in this situation, right, if they just want to hire the cheapest workers to accomplish a certain task, they have no reason to hire white workers in order to have their firms be integrated. In other words, a firm with black workers or with non-white workers is not going to be willing to pay more for their labor than a firm with only white workers, right? They get no benefit from having some white workers on staff. So because firms are profit maximizing, they're choosing the cheapest labor they can. We know that the wage of a white worker in an integrated firm has to equal the wage of non-white workers, right? Otherwise, the firm will just hire more non-white workers, which is going to tell us that the only way that we would have white workers work in non-white firms, or in integrated firms, is if the wage of white workers was lower than the wage of non-white workers. There's no reason at all that the wage of of white workers should be lower than the wage of non-white workers, because then firms would be better off hiring all white workforces. So we can say that the wage of white workers at white firms equal the wage of non-white workers equal the wage of white workers in integrated firms, which is never going to happen. And the ultimate conclusion of this model is going to be that when employees are prejudiced against each other, the consequence is not going to be the creation of a wage gap between white and non-white workers. The consequence is going to be a segregation of the workforce, so that some firms only hire non-white workers, other firms only hire white workers. Now, there's a couple important caveats I want to throw at you, and we'll be talking more about caveats later. The first one is that in this analysis, as with all the analyses we've done, we've assumed that labor markets are perfectly competitive. If that's the case, if labor markets are perfectly competitive, then all that matters for workers is their wage. They don't really care how many firms are discriminating against them versus not discriminating against them. All they're going to care about is the wage that they can earn at the best firm for them to work. In the real world, this is not the case, right? In the real world, it takes a lot of time and effort to look for a job. Jobs differ from each other in a number of ways. People care about things like having a short commute. They care about the specific thing that their firm is doing. They care about things like the view out of their windows. They care about whether they get along with their coworkers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a consequence, a lot of these sorts of discrimination that in Becker's world have no or fairly small consequences for marginalized or discriminated against workers might have pretty profound consequences if you're a worker in one of these categories actually looking for a job, right? In the case of employee discrimination, what this model might suggest is that non-white workers are going to have fewer options about where to work than do white workers, right? A non-prejudiced white worker could walk into any firm in this model and earn the prevailing wage. Non-white worker can only earn the prevailing wage at firms that choose not to cater to prejudiced workers, right? If that's the case, you might expect, as you see, that non-white workers are going to have longer commutes on average, are going to have worse access to healthcare benefits, are going to generally have fewer choices about who they're going to work for, right, and what boss they're going to choose. That's true of all of the models that we've looked at so far. I think an important way to read these is not to say, oh, Becker has proven that only customer discrimination can lead to long-run labor market disequilibrium. I think what we can show here, or the better way to read this, is that Becker has shown how different kinds of discrimination are going to exert forces on markets, right, given the level of competitive pressure, right? So what we should expect is that the more competitive a labor market is, in the face of employee prejudices, the more we should see segregation across workplaces. We shouldn't necessarily see bigger wage gaps. If we see greater competitive forces in markets where employers are prejudiced, we should generally expect that to increase the cost to employers of maintaining those prejudices, right, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, last thing I'm going to say is that the final weakness of the Becker models, which I do think are very useful, is that they treat prejudice as exogenous, right? They just say that there's these values D that model the degree to which one group of people has distaste or discriminatory preferences towards another. We don't know where those come from. All we know is what the market does with them. One of the things that later work has done, including the work we're going to be looking at next class, is thinking about where these discriminatory preferences come from in the first place, and in particular, whether they can be a consequence of market interactions, right? Sustained and produced by competitive markets, rather than just being a thing that walks into competitive markets and has some effect. Okay, that's enough for today. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I can't wait to talk to you about all of this. Please let me know if you want to hear any more about any of this further.